Long before history was measured in years, before calendars were carved into stone, before memory learned to count itself, there was a world that believed time was endless. Not infinite in the way we imagine it now, but vast, slow, and unhurried. A world where beginnings stretched so far into the distance that they blurred into myth. In that world, the past was not short, it was not fragile, it was not something easily forgotten, it was enormous. Tonight, we begin not with a story, but with a list. A simple list of names, cities, numbers. At first glance, it appears ordinary, administrative even, something meant to be archived, copied, and preserved. But as we read further, something quietly unsettling emerges. The first king on this list did not rule for decades. He did not rule for centuries. He did not even rule for millennia. According to the text, he ruled for 1,200 years. This is not a metaphor introduced by a poet. It is not a legend whispered by priests. It is a number recorded by scribes, pressed carefully into wet clay and baked until permanent. Tonight we will not rush to explain this away. We will not leap toward conclusions. We will not force the ancient world to speak in modern language. Instead, we will do something quieter. We will listen. To understand this list, we must first understand the people who wrote it. They lived in the land between two rivers. A flat, fertile region where the earth itself seemed to remember every flood. This land would later be called Mesopotamia, but long before that name existed, it was simply home. Here, some of the earliest cities on earth emerged, not villages, not temporary camps, but true cities with walls, temples, storehouses, and laws. These people wrote everything down. They recorded grain deliveries. They recorded debts. They recorded marriages, prayers, omens, and stars. And they recorded kings. Not because they were obsessed with power, but because kingship to them was not merely political. It was cosmic. The list we are exploring tonight is known to us as the Sumerian King List. It exists in multiple copies, not one tablet, not one fragile source, but many, found in different cities, written by different scribes, copied across centuries. Each version varies slightly, but the structure remains remarkably consistent. It begins the same way, with a sentence that changes everything. When kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This is not poetry. It is not presented as metaphor. It is presented as a statement of record. Kingship did not begin with human agreement. It did not emerge gradually. It descended. From where the text does not elaborate, only that it came down. The first city named is Eridu. This is important. Eridu is not just any city. In Sumerian tradition, it is the first city. The place where civilization itself began. Archaeology confirms that Eridu is ancient, layer upon layer of human occupation, stretching far back into prehistory. But the King List is not interested in archaeology. It is interested in order, and order always begins with Eridu. The first king named is Alulim. No titles, no descriptions, just a name and a number. Alulim ruled for 8 sars. A sar is a unit of time in the Sumerian numerical system. 8 sars equals 1,200 years. The list does not pause to justify this. It does not explain, it does not soften the claim, it simply continues. The next king ruled for tens of thousands of years, and the next, 8 kings in total ruling before a great flood, their combined reigns stretching across hundreds of thousands of years. Then, abruptly, everything changes. After the flood, reigns shorten. Kings rule for centuries, then decades. Names become more familiar, cities shift. Time suddenly behaves as we expect it to. This transition is so clean, so deliberate, that it demands attention. The scribes were capable of writing normal reign lengths. They knew how to count human years. So why didn't they use them at the beginning? It is tempting here to laugh, to dismiss the numbers as absurd, to call them primitive mistakes. But this would be a misunderstanding, not of the numbers, but of the people who wrote them. The Sumerians were not confused about mathematics. They invented advanced systems of counting. They tracked the movement of planets. They divided time with precision. Their number system, based on 60, is still with us today. 60 seconds, 60 minutes. These are not accidents. The numbers in the King List are not random. They are structured, intentional, exact. They are too perfect to be errors. So what then are they? Before we attempt to answer that, we must slow down. Because this list is not doing what modern history does. It is not trying to reconstruct the past as it actually happened. It is doing something older, something deeper. It is placing the present inside a vast cosmic memory. In the ancient world, history was not separate from meaning. Events did not simply occur. They belonged. A king did not rule merely because he was strong. He ruled because order allowed him to. And order came from somewhere beyond the human world. This is why the list begins with heaven. The phrase kingship descended from heaven is critical. It does not say kings descended. It does not say gods ruled. It says kingship, the institution itself, came down. Authority was not invented, it was received. And those who ruled closest to that descent were closer to its source, closer to the sacred, closer to timelessness. Long lifespans in this context may not represent biology. They may represent proximity. The first kings lived in an age where time itself had not yet contracted, where memory was longer, where order was newer, where the distance between gods and humans was smaller. This is not unique to Sumer. Many ancient cultures describe early ages where beings lived longer, knew more, and existed closer to creation itself. As time progresses, something is lost, lives shorten, knowledge fragments, memory fades. The Sumerian King List reflects this pattern with startling clarity. And then there is the flood. The flood is not described in detail here. It does not need to be. The list simply states, then the flood swept over the land. That is all, no drama, no warning, no explanation, just a boundary. Everything before the flood belongs to one kind of time. Everything after belongs to another. The flood is not merely a disaster. It is a reset, a line drawn across memory. From this point on, the list feels almost modern. Kings rule for realistic spans. Cities rise and fall. Dynasties change. History as we recognize it begins, which raises a quiet question. If the early numbers were symbolic, why preserve them at all? Why not start the list after the flood? Why insist on recording a time so distant, so alien, so impossible by modern standards? Because forgetting was never the goal. The goal was continuity. To show that the present, with its fragile kings and brief reigns, was still connected to something ancient, sacred, and vast. The list says, in effect, we remember where authority came from, even if we no longer live in that age. As we move forward in this series, we will examine these numbers closely. We will explore how Sumerians understood time, why base 60 mattered, how sacred mathematics encoded meaning. We will compare these reigns to other ancient traditions. We will look at how modern scholars interpret the list and why extreme interpretations persist. But for now, it is enough to sit with the opening. A world that remembered itself as far older than we are comfortable believing. A list that begins not with humans but with heaven. And a king whose reign stretches so long that it forces us to ask not, did this really happen? But rather, what did it mean to them? When we speak of ancient history, we often imagine stories passed from mouth to mouth, voices echoing across generations, memories reshaped by time and retelling. But the people who composed the King List did not rely on memory alone. They trusted clay. Wet, heavy clay pressed beneath the thumb of a scribe, marked with deliberate strokes, then hardened by fire until the words could no longer change. Clay does not forget easily. It breaks, it shatters, it erodes, but when it survives, it preserves a moment with unusual honesty. And the Sumerian King List survives, not once, not accidentally, but repeatedly. The list has been discovered in fragments and copies across multiple ancient cities. Some versions are damaged, others incomplete, some carefully copied centuries after the earliest kings were said to rule. Yet even across time and distance, the structure remains. The same opening, the same cities, the same impossible reigns. This is not coincidence, it is tradition. Scribes in ancient Mesopotamia were not free improvisers. They were trained specialists, educated for years in tablet houses where copying texts was both discipline and devotion. To copy a list like this was not casual labor, it was an act of preservation. Each stroke of the stylus carried responsibility not only to accuracy but to continuity. A scribe did not ask, "Do I believe this?" A scribe asked, "What must not be lost?" And so, generation after generation, the list was copied, even as dynasties rose and fell. Even as cities were abandoned, even as languages shifted, the list endured, which tells us something essential. These early reigns were not embarrassing errors to be corrected. They were not naive relics to be trimmed away. They were foundational. Modern readers often approach the King List as if it were attempting to do what modern history does. We expect dates, chronology, verification, but the list is doing something older and perhaps more profound. It is anchoring the present to an origin beyond human reach. Consider the order of information. The list does not describe what the kings did. It does not praise their victories. It does not recount their failures. It gives us only three things: a name, a city, and time. This is not biography. It is cosmology. Time in the ancient world was not simply duration. It was quality. Some moments were heavy with meaning. Others were thin, forgettable. The earliest time, the time before the flood, was thick, dense. A time when events mattered more, lasted longer, and echoed further. To say a king ruled for 1,200 years may not be to say he lived that long in flesh and bone. It may be to say that his reign occupied an age. The Sumerian units of time themselves hint at this. They did not measure years the way we do now, as a simple procession of identical units. Their system was hierarchical, built on cycles. On returns, on cosmic rhythms, a sar was not just a number, it was a complete turning. To rule for 8 sars was to rule across a fullness of time, and the numbers repeat with intention. They align with sacred multiples, they stack neatly. They reflect order, not chaos. If these were mistakes, they would be uneven. If they were exaggerations, they would be theatrical. Instead, they are restrained, almost quiet, which brings us to the cities. The list does not scatter its kings randomly across the land. It moves deliberately, from Eridu to Bad Tabira to Larak to Sippar to Shurapak. These are not arbitrary names, they are ancient centers, places associated with craft, ritual, and survival. Each city represents a function in the early world. Eridu, the sacred beginning; Bad Tabira, metallurgy; Sippar, the sun and justice; Shurapak, wisdom before the flood. The list is mapping civilization itself, and then again the flood. It arrives without warning, no moral lesson. No divine speech, just a sentence. Then the flood swept over the land. This simplicity is striking. The scribes did not need to explain the flood. Everyone already knew. The flood was not a story, it was a memory. After the flood, the list resumes. Kingship descends again, cities reappear, but something has changed. Time has shrunk. Reigns shorten dramatically. Hundreds of years become decades. The world has entered a new condition. This pattern, a long, sacred beginning, followed by a contraction after catastrophe, appears again and again across cultures. It is not a claim of literal immortality. It is a recognition of loss. Something vast once existed, something closer to origin, and now we live further away. It is important to say what the King List does not do. It does not claim technological wonders. It does not describe flying machines or hidden empires. Those ideas belong to much later imaginations. The list is quieter than that. Its concern is legitimacy. Who has the right to rule? And where did that right come from? By tracing kingship back to heaven and by extending early reigns beyond ordinary time, the list accomplishes something subtle. It makes all later kings part of a single, unbroken chain. Even the weakest ruler inherits authority from the first. Even the shortest reign is connected to eternity. This is why later kings wanted to be on the list. To be excluded was to be forgotten. To be included was to belong. The list was not static. It was edited, updated, expanded, but its beginning remained untouched. You could add yourself at the end. You could never rewrite the start. Modern scholars approach this text with care. They do not read the early reigns as literal years. They understand them as symbolic, as mytho-historical, as expressions of worldview rather than record-keeping. But they also do not dismiss the list. Because symbolism, too, is evidence. It tells us how people understood their place in time, and this is perhaps the most important point. The Sumerians were not confused about reality. They were articulating a different one. A reality where time itself had layers, where authority flowed downward, where memory mattered more than measurement. When we encounter the number 240, 1200, our instinct is to recoil, to say, that cannot be true. But the better question is not whether it is true in our terms. The better question is, why was it meaningful in theirs? In the ancient world, to begin at the beginning was not to begin with humans. It was to begin with order, with alignment, with the moment when the universe allowed civilization to exist. The King List is not telling us how long Alulim lived. It is telling us how far away the beginning was. As we continue, we will slow even further. We will examine the mathematics beneath these numbers, the sacred logic of 60, the relationship between time, sky, and authority. We will compare this list to others carved in stone and memory, and we will see that the Sumerians were not alone in imagining a past far deeper than history can easily hold. For now, let the clay speak. Let the list unfold at its own pace. And let the silence between numbers tell us what words cannot. To move any deeper into the King List, we must let go of how we usually understand numbers. In the modern world, numbers are tools. They measure, they calculate, they reduce complexity into something manageable. But in the ancient world, especially in the world of early Mesopotamia, numbers did not merely measure reality. They described its structure. For the Sumerians, numbers were not neutral. They were not interchangeable. They carried weight. Some numbers mattered more than others. Some numbers appeared again and again, not because they were convenient, but because they were meaningful. Among these, one number stood above the rest, 60. The Sumerian number system was built on 60, not 10, not 12, 60. This choice shaped everything: time, space, astronomy, ritual. It is the reason we still divide hours into minutes and circles into degrees. 60 was not arbitrary. It was divisible, flexible, and complete. It could be broken down evenly in many ways, making it ideal for describing cycles, especially cycles that returned. In this system, time was not a straight line. It was a turning, a return, a rhythm. When the King List speaks in SARs, it is not simply counting years. It is counting cycles of order. A SAR represented completion, a fullness that had run its course. To rule for one SAR was not merely to reign for a long time. It was to reign for a complete age. This changes how we hear the numbers. 8 SARs for Alulim is not 8 long stretches of identical time. It is 8 full turnings of cosmic order, each one complete, each one meaningful. Together they form something immense, not because it is exaggerated, but because it is structured. This is why the early reigns feel unreal to us. They were never meant to feel human. They belong to a time before time behaved as it does now. A time when kingship itself had not yet been limited. The Sumerians believed the universe was ordered, not random, not chaotic, but arranged according to principles that could be known, observed, and honored. Heaven and earth mirrored each other. What happened above was reflected below. This is why kingship descended from heaven. Authority was not invented by humans. It was aligned with the cosmos. In such a worldview, the earliest rulers would naturally exist closer to that alignment. Their reigns would stretch longer because the distance between heaven and earth had not yet widened. Time itself would feel different, heavier, slower, more enduring. As the world moved further from its origin, something subtle occurred. Time compressed, lives shortened, memory fragmented. This was not seen as punishment. It was simply the condition of distance. The King List does not mourn this loss. It records it quietly, without commentary. What makes this remarkable is that the scribes never attempted to normalize the early numbers. They did not revise them downward. They did not add explanations. They left them intact, as if to say, this is not for us to correct. Later kings with reigns of 20 or 30 years are recorded with the same seriousness as those who ruled for tens of thousands. The list does not privilege one over the other. It simply places them in sequence. This equality is important. It suggests that meaning does not depend on duration alone. A short reign still belongs to the same story. Modern readers sometimes assume that ancient people were obsessed with the past, that they looked backward because they lacked a sense of progress. But this misunderstands the relationship. The past was not behind them, it was beneath them, supporting them, holding the present in place. To lose the beginning was to lose legitimacy. This is why beginnings are so carefully preserved, even when they are strange. Even when they defy belief, especially then, there is another detail often overlooked. The King List does not say that the early kings were immortal. It never uses that word. It does not describe eternal life. It describes long rule, authority extended, not bodies. This distinction matters. The list is not concerned with biology. It is concerned with order, who ruled, where, and for how long order remained stable. In this sense, a reign is not the lifespan of a person. It is the lifespan of a condition. This helps explain why later versions of the list could update dynasties while leaving the ancient section untouched. The early part was not history to be revised, it was structure. Across the ancient world, we see similar patterns, long genealogies, extended ages, early ancestors who lived far longer than later ones. This is not coincidence. It is a shared way of thinking about origins. The closer one stands to creation, the more time stretches. The further one moves away, the more it collapses. In Mesopotamia, this collapse is marked by the flood. In other cultures, it is marked by different events, but the pattern remains. The flood is not only destruction, it is compression. It brings the world into a new scale, a human scale. After the flood, the list becomes practical. Kings rule cities we recognize. Reigns last manageable spans. History becomes something that can be remembered without awe, and yet the early section remains. Like a deep foundation beneath a building, unseen but essential. There's a temptation, especially in modern interpretations, to turn these early kings into something else. Gods, giants, visitors, but the text does not ask us to do that. It is already doing enough. Its ambition is not spectacle, it is continuity. By preserving the memory of a vast beginning, the King List ensures that no present moment can claim to be the first. No ruler can pretend to stand alone. Everyone inherits. This may be the quiet genius of the list. It limits power by extending it backward. No king can say, I am the source. The source is always earlier, always beyond reach. In this way, the King List is not propaganda alone. It is restraint. As we move forward, we will look at how later cultures encountered these numbers, how scholars tried to make sense of them, how misunderstandings emerged, and why the allure of extreme interpretations has never entirely faded. But for now, we remain with the numbers themselves, patient, unrushed, allowing them to be what they are, not mistakes, not miracles, but expressions of a worldview that measured reality not only in years but in meaning. Time in the beginning was not scarce, it was abundant, and abundance did not need to hurry. There is a moment in the King List where everything changes and yet almost nothing is said. No warning, no description of rising waters, no cries, no chaos, no names of the lost. Just a single sentence placed calmly between rains. Then the flood swept over the land. That is all, no emphasis, no explanation, and somehow it is enough. The power of that sentence lies not in what it tells us, but in what it assumes. It assumes the flood needs no introduction. It assumes the listener already understands. It assumes memory. This was not a new story when the list was written. It was an old one. In the ancient world, catastrophe was not always narrated with detail. Sometimes it was simply marked, a boundary placed across time, before and after. The flood in the King List is not a spectacle. It is a divider. Everything before it belongs to one order of existence. Everything after belongs to another. The kings before the flood do not merely rule longer. They exist in a different scale of reality. Their time is broad, uncompressed, unbroken. After the flood, time behaves. It shortens. It fragments. It begins to resemble what we know. This is not accidental. The flood is doing conceptual work. It is shrinking the world. To modern ears, flood stories often sound like moral tales, punishment, judgment, a reset imposed from above. But in the King List, the flood is not moralized. It is not framed as deserved or undeserved. It is simply something that happened, a force that passed through the land and altered the conditions of existence. The text does not say the kings were wicked. It does not say the gods were angry. It does not say humanity failed. Those interpretations come later, much later. The King List is older than sermons. Instead, the flood functions as compression. Before it, the world can sustain kings who rule for tens of thousands of years. After it, it cannot. This tells us something important. The flood is not just water, it is limitation. In this sense, the flood does not end the ancient world, it creates the human one. After the flood, kingship descends again. This detail is subtle but critical. Kingship does not survive the flood intact, it must be restored. This implies that authority itself was disrupted, not destroyed, but displaced. The list resumes, names return, cities return, but the scale has changed. Reigns now last hundreds of years, then tens. The rhythm accelerates, history begins to move. This is where modern readers often feel relief. The numbers feel manageable again, believable, comforting, but that relief is part of the story. It signals entry into a diminished world. In many ancient traditions, the earliest age is the greatest, not because it was technologically advanced, but because it was closer to origin, closer to order. The flood marks the moment when that closeness is lost. What follows is not decline in the moral sense, it is distance. The same way memory fades with time, authority weakens with separation. The King List never says that later kings are inferior, but it does show that they are further removed. Their reigns are shorter, their cities change, dynasties replace one another more quickly, stability becomes temporary. This is history as the ancients understood it, not a march forward, but a settling. It is worth noticing that the list never attempts to recover the ancient scale. No later king is given tens of thousands of years. No dynasty claims to restore the original order. The flood is irreversible. Once time contracts, it does not expand again. This finality matters. It tells us that the early reigns were not meant to be imitated. They were meant to be remembered. In this way, the King List performs an act of humility. It reminds every future ruler that the greatest age has already passed. No matter how powerful you are, you rule in a smaller world. This perspective tempers ambition. A king might conquer a city, but he cannot conquer time. Time has already retreated. Across Mesopotamia, we find echoes of this idea, myths that describe lost ages. Texts that speak of wisdom once freely given, now difficult to obtain. The flood is often the dividing line, yet the King List remains restrained. It does not lament, it does not explain, it simply records. After the flood, the list begins to resemble something familiar. Dynasties rise in Kish, then Uruk, then Ur. Power shifts, cities compete. This is the world of human politics, and yet the presence of the ancient section changes how we read all that follows. Every short reign is placed against an immeasurable backdrop. Every conflict feels smaller. The list does not glorify the present, it relativizes it. This may be why the list was so valuable. It provided context. In a world where kings often claimed divine favor, the King List quietly reminded them that divinity once stood much closer and then withdrew. There is something deeply human about this. We, too, imagine golden ages, times when things were better, simpler, more complete. The King List gives this instinct a formal structure, but unlike nostalgia, it does not ask to return, it accepts loss. The flood does not invite recovery, it establishes limits. When we look back at Alulim's reign now through the lens of the flood, the number begins to feel different, not absurd, but distant, like a mountain seen across a plain. Large not because it dominates us, but because it is far away. The early kings are not giants among men. They are figures at the horizon of memory. Their scale tells us how far the present has traveled. This may explain why the King List never dramatizes them. They are not characters, they are markers. To modern audiences, this restraint can feel strange. We expect stories, motives, conflict, but the King List is not interested in drama. It is interested in placement. Who came first, who followed, and how far away the beginning lies. As the list moves forward, the flood recedes into the background. It is not mentioned again. Its work is done, time has been resized, but the presence of the flood lingers. Every reign afterward is measured against what came before, even if unconsciously. This is how ancient texts shape perception. They do not argue, they arrange. By placing the flood where it does, the King List teaches the reader how to feel about time. Not anxious, not triumphant, but aware. Aware that the present is not the center. Aware that authority is inherited. Aware that beginnings are unreachable. As we continue, we will see how later cultures misunderstood this arrangement. How symbolic time was mistaken for literal chronology, how questions meant to orient meaning were turned into puzzles demanding solutions. But before that, we must sit longer with the flood, not as water alone, but as the moment when the ancient world decided how much of itself could be remembered. History, after all, is not only what happened, it is what survives. The King List survives because it accepted limitation. It did not try to preserve everything. It preserved structure, and in doing so, it preserved something more enduring than detail. It preserved a worldview, a world where time once stretched endlessly until it did not, where kings once ruled across ages until they ruled across years, where memory once reached the beginning until it learned where to stop. At some point long after the last Sumerian scribe pressed a stylus into clay, the King List stopped being a living document. The cities it named fell silent. The language it was written in ceased to be spoken aloud. The hands that once copied it vanished into the soil, and yet the tablets remained, buried, broken, waiting. When modern scholars first encountered fragments of the Sumerian King List, they did not meet it as its creators intended. They met it as strangers. Separated not only by millennia, but by assumptions so deeply ingrained that they were nearly invisible. Modern history is built on a particular expectation, that the past should behave like the present, That time should move forward evenly. That reigns should be counted in years. That records exist to tell us what really happened. When the King List refused to conform to these expectations, confusion followed. Early readers did what humans often do when confronted with something that does not fit. They tried to force it into familiar shapes. Some assumed exaggeration, others assumed ignorance. A few assumed deception. Each response revealed more about the reader than about the text. The numbers became the problem. 200,000 years was not merely implausible, it was offensive to modern chronology. It threatened carefully constructed timelines. It disrupted evolutionary models. It resisted neat categorization, and so it had to be explained away. But explanation, when rushed, can become distortion. Some early interpreters treated the King List as a failed attempt at history. They assumed the scribes were trying and failing to record literal reigns. This assumption quietly erased something essential. It erased intention. The scribes were not naive. They did not lack the ability to count. They were operating within a framework that modern readers had forgotten. A framework where meaning mattered more than measurement. Other readers went in the opposite direction. Rather than dismiss the numbers, they embraced them literally. If the reigns were that long, then the kings must not have been human. They must have been gods or giants or visitors. These interpretations were not ancient, they were modern. They emerged from the same discomfort, just expressed differently. Both responses, dismissal and literalism, share the same flaw. They assume the text must mean what we expect texts to mean. The King List was never meant to answer the question, how long did this person live? It was answering a different question. Where did authority come from and how far back does it reach? This is why modern debates about the list often feel unsatisfying. They argue over facts when the text is offering orientation. When we ask whether Alulim truly ruled for 241,200 years, we are asking a question the list is not trying to answer. The list does not care whether we believe the number. It cares that we understand what it represents. The earliest section of the list belongs to what scholars sometimes call mytho-history. Not myth in the sense of falsehood, but myth in the sense of meaning-bearing narrative. It occupies a space where history and cosmology overlap. In this space, time is not counted for precision. It is stretched to express significance. The beginning must feel vast, or it will not support what comes after. Modern readers often underestimate how important this was. In a world without printed books, without centralized archives, without standardized calendars, continuity was fragile. A king's claim to rule had to be anchored deeply. The deeper the anchor, the stronger the claim. The King List provides that anchor. By extending kingship back into a time beyond human scale, it makes every later ruler part of something enduring. This does not mean the list was propaganda in the modern sense. It was not crafted to deceive. It was crafted to stabilize. There is a difference. To stabilize authority is to remind people that order did not begin yesterday. That chaos is older than rebellion. That continuity survives disruption. This is why the list survived even as specific dynasties did not. It was useful not because it praised particular kings, but because it framed kingship itself. When Assyriologists and historians began translating the King List in earnest, they faced a dilemma. How do you translate meaning across worldviews? Footnotes multiplied, cautious language emerged. Scholars spoke of symbolic numbers, of ritual time, of ideological frameworks. And yet, outside academic circles, the numbers continued to attract attention. They still do, even now. There is something deeply unsettling about a past that refuses to fit, a past that is larger than expected, older than permitted, stranger than comfortable. The King List offers such a past, quietly, without apology. This is why it continues to inspire speculation, not because it proves anything extraordinary, but because it destabilizes certainty. When people ask whether the list suggests lost civilizations or forgotten ages, they are responding to that destabilization. They sense that something is being withheld, not by the scribes but by our own frameworks. But the King List does not hide information, it reveals it differently. It does not say, here is what happened. It says, here is how we understand where we came from. Understanding this difference changes everything. If the list were simply wrong, it would be easy to discard. If it were simply literal, it would be easy to sensationalize. But it is neither. It occupies an uncomfortable middle ground, one that demands patience. The Sumerians did not expect future readers to interrogate their numbers. They expected them to accept their placement, to see that history did not begin with the present, to recognize that authority flows downward. In this sense, the King List is not backward-looking. It is grounding. It says, you stand on something ancient, even if you no longer understand it. This is perhaps why modern readers struggle. We live in a culture that values novelty, that celebrates beginnings, that wants to believe it stands at the center of time. The King List quietly disagrees. It says the center has already passed, that we are inheritors, not originators. There is humility in this and discomfort. As we move further into the modern reception of the King List, we will see how this discomfort shaped interpretation, how scholars tried to contain the past, how others tried to expand it, and how both responses reveal our relationship with time itself. But for now, we pause, not to conclude, but to let the tension remain. The clay tablets do not argue, they do not persuade, they wait. They wait for readers willing to step out of their own assumptions, readers willing to accept that the ancient world was not trying to be modern. The King List does not ask us to believe that humans lived for hundreds of thousands of years. It asks us to believe that meaning once stretched farther than we are used to, and perhaps that it still does. In the ancient world, power did not stand on its own. It leaned backward toward memory, toward lineage, toward something older than the one who held it. A king who ruled only by strength ruled briefly. A king who ruled by inheritance, by belonging to a story already in motion, ruled longer, even if his years were few. This is where the King List becomes most revealing, not in the impossible numbers, not in the flood, but in how calmly it arranges authority. The list does not argue for kingship, it assumes it. Kingship exists because it has always existed. Its origin is not debated, it is stated, and once stated, everything else follows. This is subtle power, not the loud declaration of conquest, but the quiet assertion of inevitability. By placing every king into a sequence that begins beyond human memory, the list removes the possibility of novelty. No ruler is new. No dynasty is unprecedented. Every reign is inherited. This mattered deeply in a world where cities rose and fell with alarming speed, where walls were breached, where rivers changed course, where famine and flood could erase generations. In such a world, authority needed to feel stable even when life was not. The King List provided that stability. It did so not by exaggerating the present, but by extending the past. When a new dynasty took power, it did not claim to invent kingship. It claimed to receive it. This distinction matters. To invent is to risk rejection. To receive is to imply inevitability. The phrase kingship descended from heaven is not merely theological, it is political. It removes kingship from human negotiation. If authority comes from above, then it cannot be voted away. It cannot be argued into existence or out of it. It simply is. And yet the King List is not absolute. It records disruption. Dynasties end. Cities lose prominence. Power moves, but kingship itself remains. This balance is important. It allows critique without collapse. A king may fail. A city may fall, but the structure endures. In this way, the king list contains power even as it supports it. By reminding rulers that kingship existed long before them, it also reminds them that it will continue after. No reign is final. No authority is ultimate. This is not the language of tyranny. It is the language of continuity. Modern readers sometimes assume that ancient texts served only those in power, that they were tools of domination, but the king list complicates this view. Yes, it legitimizes kingship, but it also limits it. By placing the greatest reigns in the unreachable past, it prevents any living king from claiming supreme status. The longest reigns are already taken. They belong to figures who cannot be challenged, cannot be surpassed, cannot be overthrown. They are safe, and because they are safe, they are useful. A king ruling for 30 years cannot compete with Alulim. And so he does not try. He rules within his scale. This quiet containment may be one of the list's most important functions. It defines the ceiling. In societies without written constitutions, without formal limits on power, such symbolic ceilings mattered. They shaped expectation. They taught restraint. The king list does not say, "Do not overreach." It shows what overreach would look like and places it forever out of reach. As centuries passed and cultures changed, this symbolic function remained. Even when the language was no longer understood, the structure was preserved. This tells us that the list's power did not lie in its details, it lay in its shape. Lists are deceptively simple. They do not persuade through argument, they persuade through order. By arranging names in sequence, the king list creates a sense of inevitability. This comes next, then this. No commentary is needed. This is a powerful way to speak. It leaves little room for objection. One does not argue with a list, one reads it. In this sense, the king list is not narrative, it is architecture. It builds a framework within which history can occur. And once built, that framework becomes invisible. Later rulers did not need to cite the list explicitly. Its assumptions had already seeped into culture. Kingship was old, older than memory. That was enough. And yet the list never claims that kings are divine. This is another subtle restraint. Kingship descends from heaven, but kings themselves remain human. They die, they fail, they are replaced. This separation matters. It prevents the collapse between authority and deity. Kings rule by alignment, not by identity. This may explain why the list survived regime changes. Empires rose that did not share Sumerian religion. Languages shifted. Gods were renamed. But the idea of kingship as inherited order remained useful. The list could be adapted without being rewritten. This adaptability is a sign of strength. Texts that are too specific break when conditions change. Texts that operate at the level of structure endure. The king list operates at the level of structure. This brings us back to the extraordinary reigns at the beginning. They are not anomalies. They are load-bearing. Remove them and the entire framework weakens. If kingship begins in ordinary time, then it can end there too. Authority is recent, then it can be undone. By pushing the origin of kingship beyond human scale, the list protects it. This does not mean that the Sumerians believed the early kings were literally present. It means they believed authority itself was ancient. This belief shapes everything that follows. It shapes how conflicts are understood, how succession is justified, how rebellion is framed. To rebel against a king is not merely to oppose a person. It is to disrupt an order older than memory. And yet rebellions occurred, cities fought, dynasties collapsed. The king list records this without panic because collapse does not threaten the structure. This calm acceptance of change within continuity is one of the list's most remarkable qualities. It suggests a worldview that expects instability but trusts order. This is not optimism, it is resilience. As modern readers, we often look for intention in terms of deception or belief. Did they really believe this? Were they trying to convince others? But these questions may miss the point. The King List is not propaganda in the modern sense. It is orientation. It teaches people how to situate themselves in time, not at the beginning, not at the end, but somewhere in between. This is a difficult lesson, especially for cultures that value originality, that want to believe they stand at a turning point. The King List denies that privilege. It insists that the turning point has already passed, long ago. This insistence does not make the present meaningless. It makes it provisional, and provisional things are treated with care. As we continue, we will see how later cultures both inherited and misunderstood this lesson. How the desire for certainty led some to literalize the numbers, how the fear of disruption led others to dismiss them. But before we move forward, it is worth sitting with the idea that the King List was not meant to glorify rulers. It was meant to place them, to say, you rule now. Others ruled before, others will rule after, and none of you are the beginning. There comes a moment when reading the Sumerian King List slowly and without haste, when a quiet realization begins to take shape, not all at once and not loudly but gradually, like a sound heard from far away, that the list is not as strange as it first appeared. Its numbers may be extreme, its scale may feel uncomfortable, its beginning may seem unreachable. And yet the shape of the story it tells is deeply familiar. Across the ancient world, whenever people attempted to speak about origins, about the first rulers, the first ancestors, the first ordering of chaos, they did not begin small. They began vast. They began with time that stretched so far back that it no longer behaved like time at all. In many cultures, the earliest beings live longer. They rule longer. They exist closer to the moment when the world itself was still settling into form. This is not coincidence, it is pattern. When ancient people imagined beginnings, they did not imagine fragility. They imagined fullness. The beginning was not weak, it was strong. It was not brief, it was enduring. The Sumerian King List is one expression of this instinct, not the only one, not even the most dramatic, but one of the clearest. Consider the long genealogies found in other traditions, where early ancestors live for centuries, sometimes nearly 1,000 years before lifespans begin to shrink. These stories are often read today as primitive misunderstandings of biology or as symbolic fables stripped of historical value, but this reading may miss something essential. These traditions are not competing with science. They are answering a different question. They are asking, how far away is the beginning? To say that the first ancestors lived longer is not necessarily to make a claim about flesh and bone. It is to say that the world itself was closer to its source, that it had not yet been worn thin by repetition. In the earliest age, things lasted, meaning lasted, order lasted. As time progressed, that durability weakened, not because of failure, but because of distance. Distance from creation, distance from origin. The King List does not dramatize this idea. It does not mourn it. It simply records the contraction. This contraction is not unique to Mesopotamia. In ancient Egypt, the earliest kings were associated with divine or semi-divine status, their reigns placed in a time when gods and humans had not yet fully separated. In other traditions, the first rulers are culture heroes, lawgivers, or beings who straddle the line between human and cosmic order. The details differ. The intuition remains. The intuition is this: the farther back one goes, the larger time becomes. This is not how modern history works. Modern history compresses the distant past, making it vague and indistinct, while expanding the recent past with detail and precision. Ancient history often does the opposite. It enlarges the beginning and compresses what comes later. This inversion can feel disorienting, but it reveals something about ancient priorities. The past mattered not because it was accurate, but because it was foundational. Accuracy was useful, foundation was essential. When the Sumerians recorded kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, they were not trying to deceive future readers. They were trying to ensure that the origin of authority could not be forgotten. Memory, in this sense, is not a record of events. It is a structure of meaning. The King List structures memory by placing the present within a vast continuum. It refuses to allow the now to feel absolute. This refusal is quiet. It does not scold, it simply situates. Modern listeners sometimes struggle with this way of thinking. We are trained to expect forward motion, progress, improvement. We look to the future for meaning. The King List looks backward, but not in despair. In grounding, by anchoring the present to an ancient beginning, the list stabilizes identity. It says, you belong to something older than yourself. Even if you cannot fully understand it, this sense of belonging is powerful. It creates continuity across catastrophe. Cities fall, rivers flood, languages change, but the line remains. This is why the flood does not erase kingship, it interrupts it. Kingship descends again, not because it must, but because the structure demands continuity. This continuity is not guaranteed by force, it is guaranteed by memory. In the absence of memory, authority becomes fragile. In the presence of memory, even weak rulers feel legitimate. The King List functions as memory made durable. It is important to notice how little emotion the list displays. There is no pride, no sorrow, no triumph, just sequence. This emotional restraint is part of what makes the list effective. It does not try to persuade, it simply presents order. Order, once seen, is difficult to unsee. This may explain why the list endured long after the culture that produced it changed. The Assyrians preserved it, the Babylonians preserved it, not because they believed every detail, but because the framework remained useful. Even as gods were renamed and rituals adjusted, the idea that kingship had an ancient, sacred origin continued to stabilize political life. In this way, the King List outlived belief. It became habit. Habits do not require justification. They simply operate. When modern readers encounter the list, they often want resolution, an answer. Were the numbers literal or symbolic? Were the kings human or divine? Did the flood really happen? These questions are understandable, but they may be misplaced. The King List is not a puzzle waiting to be solved. It is a worldview waiting to be entered. Once entered, the numbers no longer feel outrageous. They feel proportional. A beginning should feel enormous. If it does not, it cannot support what follows. This is perhaps the deepest insight the list offers. Not about ancient kings, but about how humans imagine origins. We stretch the beginning because we need it to hold us. We place the greatest distance behind us so the present can feel situated rather than suspended. The King List does this with remarkable discipline. It does not embellish, it does not narrate, it simply extends. The early kings do not speak, they do not act, they do not struggle, they exist. And then they are gone. This minimalism is intentional. It prevents distraction. It keeps focus on scale. Scale is the message. As listeners, if we allow ourselves to hear the list without demanding modern clarity, a different understanding emerges. The list is not asking us to believe in impossible lifespans. It is asking us to accept that meaning once extended farther than our frameworks allow. This acceptance can be unsettling. It requires humility. It requires patience, but it also offers something rare: perspective. Perspective that says you are not at the beginning, you are not at the end, you are somewhere in between, standing on memory, looking forward without certainty. The ancient world lived comfortably with this ambiguity. It did not require closure. It did not need everything explained. The King List reflects this comfort. It leaves questions unanswered, not because it lacks answers, but because answers are not the point. As we continue this exploration, we will begin to see how modern discomfort with ambiguity shaped later interpretations. how the desire for certainty turned symbolic time into literal claims, how skepticism, too, became rigid, but for now it is enough to remain here, in the presence of a text that refuses to hurry, a text that expands time so the present does not feel alone, a list that begins not with explanation but with descent, kingship descending from heaven. Time descending into memory, and us listening carefully, trying to hear not just what is said, but why it was said this way. There is a moment, inevitable and quietly revealing, when a listener raised in the modern world encounters the Sumerian King List and feels a subtle pressure begin to form, a pressure not from the text itself, but from the habits of thought we carry with us. It is the pressure to decide, to classify, to resolve, to place the numbers neatly into one category or another. Either they are true or they are false. Either the kings lived that long or they did not. Either the list is history or it is myth. This pressure feels natural, it feels reasonable, and yet it is entirely foreign to the world that produced the list. The Sumerian scribes did not experience anxiety over whether their numbers would be believed. They did not anticipate debate. They did not imagine future readers arguing across centuries about the literal or symbolic nature of their work. They were not attempting to persuade, they were attempting to place. Meaning in the ancient world did not require the same kind of resolution. A thing could be meaningful without being measurable. It could be true without being literal. This distinction is difficult for modern audiences, not because it is unintelligent, but because it asks us to relax a habit that has been reinforced for generations. The habit of equating truth with factual precision. When modern readers approach the King List, they often bring with them a question shaped like a demand. Which is it, history or fiction? But the King List does not respond to this demand, it simply continues being what it is. The tension that arises here is not really about ancient kings, it is about our relationship with meaning. In a world dominated by data where information is expected to resolve uncertainty, texts like the King List feel uncooperative. They do not explain themselves. They do not apologize, they do not adjust their language to meet our expectations. This refusal can feel provocative. It can feel like a challenge, but it is neither. It is indifference. The King List was not written for us, and yet it survives to confront us. When scholars first began to translate the list, they did so with great care. They recognized early on that something unusual was happening. The numbers were too precise to be random, too consistent to be mistaken, and too extreme to be literal. This recognition led to a careful middle path. The early reigns were described as symbolic or mythological or belonging to a different category of time. But even this careful language did not satisfy everyone. Outside academic circles, the discomfort persisted. If the numbers were not literal, then what were they doing there? Why preserve them at all? Why not simplify? Why not correct? These questions reveal a modern expectation that texts exist to inform. But ancient texts often existed to orient. To orient is not to explain, it is to position. The King List positions the present within a vast temporal landscape. It does not care whether that landscape can be surveyed in detail. It only cares that it exists. When we demand literal answers from symbolic time, we are asking the wrong kind of question. It is like asking a map of the night sky to explain gravity. The map is not wrong, it is doing something else. The Sumerian King List is a map of memory, not a timeline in the modern sense, but a spatial arrangement of authority. It stretches the beginning so that the present does not feel suspended. This stretching is deliberate. It is not meant to deceive. It is meant to stabilize. The problem arises when modern readers try to compress the past into forms that feel manageable. Either the kings lived that long, in which case everything must be reconsidered, or they did not, in which case the text must be dismissed. Both options offer certainty, and certainty is comforting, but the King List resists certainty. It occupies an ambiguous space where meaning exists without resolution. This ambiguity was not a flaw in the ancient world, it was a feature. Ancient cultures did not expect texts to do all the work. They expected readers and listeners to bring understanding, context, and tradition. The list was not meant to stand alone. It existed within a web of shared assumptions. Those assumptions are no longer available to us, and so we struggle. The temptation to literalize the list is strong. If the numbers are taken at face value, then the past becomes astonishing. Ancient super-civilizations, lost epochs, forgotten histories. These ideas capture imagination because they restore a sense of wonder that modern chronology often strips away. But literalism creates its own problems. It forces the text to carry weight it was never meant to bear. It turns symbolic time into empirical claim. On the other hand, dismissal is equally tempting. If the numbers are symbolic, then they can be ignored. The early section becomes irrelevant. The list begins after the flood. History resumes, but dismissal removes the foundation. It collapses the structure. The ancient scribes did not preserve the early reigns because they were mistaken. They preserved them because they mattered. The question is not whether they happened as described. The question is what kind of truth they were expressing. Modern anxiety around this question reveals something about us. We are uncomfortable with truths that cannot be tested, with meanings that cannot be verified, with origins that cannot be pinned down. The King List offers an origin that refuses to be contained. It is too far away, too large, too quiet. This is unsettling, and so the text becomes a mirror. Those who want the past to be extraordinary see evidence of lost ages. Those who want the past to be orderly see primitive exaggeration. Both are responding to the same discomfort, the discomfort of not knowing. Ancient cultures lived with this discomfort. They did not need to solve the beginning. They needed to acknowledge it. The King List does not answer questions, it frames them. It frames kingship as something inherited, not invented. It frames time as something that contracts, not progresses. It frames the present as provisional. These frames shape how a culture understands itself. They do not need to be debated, they need to be absorbed. Modern readers trained to interrogate texts often miss this. They interrogate the King List as if it were making claims, but it is making placements. To place something is to say where it belongs, not what it proves. The early kings belong at the beginning. Their reigns belong to a time before measurement. The flood belongs between worlds. The later kings belong to history. Once this placement is understood, the list relaxes. It no longer demands interpretation, it simply exists. The conflict between symbolism and literalism is a modern conflict. The ancient world did not experience it in the same way. Symbols were not opposed to reality. They were how reality was understood. The King List speaks in symbols because symbols carry scale. Numbers alone cannot do this. Narrative alone cannot do this, but symbolic numbers arranged carefully can. When we encounter Alulim's reign again, 1,200 years, we may still feel resistance, but perhaps now it feels different, less like a claim, more like a horizon, a way of saying the beginning is very far away. This distance is not meant to frustrate us, it is meant to humble us. It reminds us that we did not invent order, that we arrived late, that we inherited structures we barely understand. The King List does not shame us for this, it simply states it. As we move forward, we will see how this symbolic approach to time gradually gave way to more literal chronologies, how writing itself changed, how the need for precision grew, and how something was lost in the process. But before we leave this space, it is worth lingering a little longer. Because the King List offers something rare, a way of thinking about time that does not rush toward explanation, a way of remembering origins without pretending to grasp them fully. In a world that demands answers, this restraint is almost radical. The ancient scribes did not try to solve the mystery of the beginning, they honored it. And in doing so, they left us a text that still unsettles, still resists, and still invites us to listen more slowly. There was a gradual moment, not sudden and not announced, when human beings began to grow uneasy with the vastness of their own beginnings. It did not happen all at once, it did not happen in one place, and it did not happen with hostility. It happened quietly as habits changed, as writing became more common, as records multiplied, and as memory began to feel less like inheritance and more like responsibility. At first, symbolic time and measured time existed side by side without tension. A king could rule for 30 years and still belong to a lineage that stretched back beyond counting. No conflict existed between these ideas. One described duration, the other described origin. But over time, as administrations grew more complex, as trade expanded, as contracts demanded precision, time began to harden. It became something that needed to be counted accurately, tracked consistently, and referenced reliably. This shift did not eliminate symbolic time, it simply pushed it further back. The beginning remained vast, but it became less present, less active, less involved in daily life. Where once the past felt alive and pressing, now it began to feel distant and abstract, a foundation rather than a companion. This change had consequences. Not dramatic ones at first, but subtle ones that accumulated over generations. When time is measured carefully, it becomes manageable. When it becomes manageable, it becomes controllable. And when it becomes controllable, it begins to lose its mystery. The Sumerian King List belongs to a moment before this transition was complete. It stands with one foot in symbolic time and one foot in emerging chronology. This is why it feels strange to modern readers. It speaks from the edge. Later historical records from Mesopotamia begin to look different. They include dates. They reference events more specifically. They track reigns with increasing accuracy. The language becomes tighter. Something is gained in this process: clarity, reliability, administrative efficiency, but something is also lost: scale. When the beginning is brought closer, it becomes easier to comprehend, but it also becomes smaller. The King List refuses this compression. It insists that the beginning remain distant, not because distance is impressive, but because it is appropriate. A beginning that can be easily grasped does not feel like a beginning. It feels like an extension of the present. Ancient cultures understood this intuitively. They did not want origins to feel familiar. They wanted them to feel other. As measured time became dominant, symbolic time did not disappear. It retreated into myth, ritual, and theology. It survived in stories rather than records. The King List, however, remained a record that spoke in symbolic time. This made it increasingly difficult to categorize. Later readers encountered it with tools that were no longer suited to its language. Chronology demanded consistency. The King List offered structure. Structure and consistency are not the same thing. This mismatch created confusion, not because the text changed, but because the expectations did. As symbolic time faded from daily use, it began to feel like fiction, something separate from reality, something optional. But for the Sumerians, symbolic time was not optional. It was essential. It told them where they stood. It told them what kind of world they inhabited. It told them that order preceded them and would outlast them. Measured time, by contrast, tells us how long something lasts. It does not tell us why it matters. This distinction is easy to miss. But it explains much of the discomfort modern readers feel when encountering ancient texts. When we read that a king ruled for 241,200 years, our instinct is to correct the number, to convert it, to reduce it, to make it reasonable. But reasonableness was not the goal, orientation was. The King List orients the present by enlarging the past. Measured time does the opposite. It compresses the past to serve the present. Neither approach is wrong. But they are not interchangeable. Problems arise when one is mistaken for the other. As historical writing evolved, measured time became dominant, dates became anchors, chronologies became frameworks, history became something that could be arranged precisely. This precision brought confidence, but it also narrowed imagination. The beginning, once vast and unknowable, became a problem to be solved, a puzzle to be reconstructed. In this environment, the King List became troublesome. It refused to conform. It refused to be solved. Some scholars attempted reconciliation. They proposed that early reigns were lunar months or seasonal counts or symbolic aggregates of dynasties. These theories were careful, thoughtful, and sincere, but even these explanations did not fully address the issue. Because the issue was not the units, it was the intention. The King List was not trying to align with later chronologies. It was preserving a worldview that predated them. As measured time advanced, symbolic time became marginalized. It was tolerated in myth but excluded from history. This division is modern. The ancient world did not recognize it. For the Sumerians, a list of kings could carry symbolic meaning without ceasing to be authoritative. Authority did not depend on factual precision. It depended on continuity. When symbolic time was pushed aside, something important happened. Authority began to rely more heavily on documentation. On contracts, on records that could be verified. This shift altered how power functioned. It made authority more fragile, more dependent on systems, less anchored in memory. The King List belongs to an earlier logic, one in which memory itself was the system. This is why the list does not explain itself. Explanation was unnecessary. Understanding was shared. Modern readers, lacking that shared context, are left to reconstruct meaning. In doing so, we often reveal our own priorities. Our desire for certainty, our discomfort with ambiguity, our need to know exactly where we stand. The King List does not grant that comfort. It reminds us that the ground beneath us was laid long before we arrived. This reminder can feel destabilizing, but it can also feel liberating. If the beginning is not ours to control, then perhaps the present is not ours to perfect. Perhaps it is ours to inhabit. The ancient world did not expect permanence, it expected recurrence. Floods returned, cities fell and rose, kings ruled briefly within a structure that endured. Measured time encourages us to think in terms of progress. Symbolic time encourages us to think in terms of cycles. The King List is cyclical. Kingship descends, is disrupted, and descends again. Cities rise, fall, and are replaced. This cyclical understanding creates resilience. It prepares a culture for loss. When catastrophe occurs, it is not the end, it is an interruption. The flood in this context is not an anomaly, it is part of the pattern. Measured time struggles with this. It treats catastrophe as something to be avoided or prevented. Symbolic time treats it as something to be integrated. The King List integrates catastrophe without explanation, without panic. This calm acceptance is difficult for modern audiences. We want causes, reasons, lessons. The ancient world wanted placement. As measured time continued to dominate, the distance between these approaches widened. Symbolic time became misunderstood, then dismissed, then exoticized, and yet it never disappeared entirely. It resurfaced in philosophy, in religion, in art. Humans never stopped needing a beginning that felt large enough to support the present. The King List is one expression of that need, not the only one, but a particularly disciplined one. It does not indulge in narrative. It does not dramatize. It simply extends. This extension is its power. When we listen to the list slowly, allowing the numbers to remain what they are, something subtle happens. We stop trying to solve the beginning and start acknowledging it. Acknowledgement does not require agreement. It requires patience. The ancient world had patience for the beginning. It did not rush toward explanation. Perhaps this is what feels most foreign to us. We live in a culture that values speed, that rewards answers, that treats uncertainty as failure. The King List treats uncertainty as condition. It assumes that the beginning cannot be fully known, only marked. By marking it with immense time, the list creates space. Space for humility, space for continuity, space for meaning. As we continue this exploration, we will see how later thinkers attempted to reconcile symbolic and measured time, how compromise emerged, how new forms of history were born. But before we move on, it is worth staying here a little longer, with a text that does not hurry, with a beginning that remains distant, with a sense that time once was allowed to be large. There's a quiet moment that arrives, often without warning, when a modern listener, having spent enough time with the Sumerian King List, realizes that the discomfort it creates does not come from confusion, nor from disbelief, nor even from the sheer scale of its numbers, but from something more intimate and more revealing. It comes from recognition. Because once the shock of the numbers fades, once the mind stops reacting to the idea of reigns measured in tens or hundreds of thousands of years, a subtler realization begins to surface that the list is not merely describing an ancient way of thinking, but quietly exposing a difference between how humans once related to time and how we relate to it now. The King List does not simply stretch the past, it stretches patience. It asks the listener to remain present without the reward of resolution, without the comfort of explanation, and without the reassurance that everything can be neatly categorized into truth or fiction, fact or myth, history or imagination. In doing so, it becomes less a document to be analyzed and more a surface upon which modern expectations are projected. Over time, the King List has become a mirror, not because it reflects ancient reality, but because it reflects modern longing. Some readers approach it with a hunger for wonder, eager to rediscover a past that feels larger, stranger, and more meaningful than the carefully bounded timelines offered by textbooks. For them, the immense reigns hint at lost wisdom, forgotten ages, and civilizations that existed beyond the reach of conventional history. Others approach it with skepticism sharpened by discipline, determined to protect chronology from disruption, to defend the integrity of evidence, and to ensure that symbolic language does not erode factual rigor. For them, the list must be contained, contextualized, and rendered harmless through explanation. Both approaches reveal something important. Neither is wrong, and neither is complete. What they share is a desire to resolve the tension the list creates, a desire the list does not share. The Sumerian King List is remarkably uninterested in whether it satisfies the reader. It does not adjust its tone. It does not clarify its intent. It does not soften its opening. It simply remains. This persistence is not accidental. It reflects a worldview that did not expect the past to be comfortable. In the ancient world, the past was not something to be mastered. It was something to be acknowledged. Acknowledgement, in this sense, did not require understanding every detail. It required acceptance of scale. The beginning was vast because it needed to be, not because anyone could prove it, but because a small beginning could not support the weight of meaning that followed. Modern culture, by contrast, often seeks beginnings that can be explained, mapped, and rendered familiar. We are uneasy with origins that resist comprehension. They make us feel unmoored. The King List offers precisely this discomfort. And in doing so, it reveals how much we depend on the illusion of closeness to the beginning. When the beginning feels close, the present feels powerful. When the beginning feels distant, the present feels provisional. Ancient cultures were comfortable with provisional existence. They did not expect permanence. They did not expect completion. They expected continuity. The King List embodies this expectation. It does not present history as a destination. It presents it as a position. You are here, it says, others were before you. Others will come after. This framing does not diminish the present. It contextualizes it. Modern readers often resist this. We prefer narratives of ascent, stories in which the present represents progress, improvement, or culmination. The King List quietly refuses this story. It suggests that the greatest scale belongs to the beginning, not the end. This suggestion can feel unsettling. It undermines the idea that knowledge accumulates cleanly over time. It challenges the assumption that newer always means better, and yet it does not reject progress. It simply refuses to worship it. The ancient world understood something that modern culture often struggles to articulate. That meaning does not necessarily increase with precision. Measured time gives us control. Symbolic time gives us orientation. The King List privileges orientation. This is why its early section is so carefully preserved, not because the details mattered, but because the distance did. Distance creates perspective. Perspective creates humility. Humility, in turn, allows societies to survive disruption. When catastrophe strikes, a culture anchored in continuity does not collapse into panic. It absorbs loss as part of a larger pattern. The flood in the King List is not framed as failure. It is framed as transition. This framing matters. It teaches the listener how to respond to uncertainty. Modern audiences often want catastrophe to teach lessons, to justify suffering, to provide meaning through explanation. The King List does not do this. It does not explain the flood. It does not moralize it. It simply places it. Placement is enough. This restraint is difficult for us. We want stories that guide emotion, that tell us how to feel. The King List offers no such guidance. It assumes emotional maturity. Assumes a listener who does not need to be told what to make of loss. This assumption may be one reason the text feels distant. It was written for an audience comfortable with ambiguity. Modern readers are often not. We want to know whether the kings were real, whether the numbers are symbolic, whether the flood corresponds to an event. These questions are understandable, but they are also revealing. They show our need for the past to behave predictably. The King List does not behave, it exists. This existence has allowed it to become a canvas. Over time, it has absorbed interpretations far removed from its origin. In some circles, it has been used to argue for hidden histories. In others, it has been cited as evidence of myth-making gone awry. In still others, it has been reduced to a curiosity. None of these uses exhaust the text. The King List remains intact because it resists ownership. It cannot be claimed entirely by skepticism or belief. It does not belong to certainty. This may be its greatest strength. A text that refuses certainty continues to invite engagement. A text that resolves itself quickly becomes obsolete. The King List has never resolved itself. Even now, thousands of years after it was first inscribed, it continues to provoke discussion, not because it contains answers, but because it refuses to narrow the question. The question it poses is not, did this really happen? The question it poses is, how far back are you willing to imagine order? This question is not historical, it is existential. Every culture answers it differently. Some place the beginning a few thousand years ago, others push it further. The Sumerians pushed it beyond counting. In doing so, they created a past large enough to hold uncertainty. Modern culture often shrinks the past in order to eliminate uncertainty. But uncertainty does not disappear, it simply relocates. The King List reminds us that uncertainty has always been present. The difference is how it is treated. Ancient cultures treated uncertainty as a condition of existence. Modern cultures treat it as a problem to be solved. This difference shapes how we read texts. It shapes what we expect from history. It shapes what we demand from meaning. The King List refuses to comply, and so it continues to unsettle. But unsettlement is not always negative. Sometimes it creates space. Space to consider that not everything meaningful must be immediately intelligible. That not every origin can be grasped, that not every past can be made comfortable. The ancient scribes understood this. They did not try to domesticate the beginning, they honored its distance. In honoring that distance, they left us something rare, a reminder that the present is not self-made. We live within structures we did not design, we inherit meanings we did not invent. The King List makes this inheritance visible. It does so quietly, without argument, without persuasion, without apology. As we continue, we will see how this quiet insistence interacts with modern imagination, how longing for depth meets fear of uncertainty, how the ancient past becomes a stage for modern anxieties. But for now, it is enough to remain here, with a text that stretches time, with sentences that refuse to hurry, with a beginning that remains distant and therefore meaningful. After everything has been said, after the numbers have been spoken slowly enough to lose their shock and gain their weight, after the flood has passed, after kings have risen and fallen, after time itself has contracted into something familiar and manageable, there is still one quiet truth the Sumerian King List leaves behind. It does not resolve itself. It does not offer a final explanation, nor does it attempt to bring the beginning closer, as if closeness were a gift. Instead, it leaves the beginning where it has always been, far away, immense, and beyond the reach of certainty. This distance is not a failure of knowledge, it is a decision. The ancient scribes who copied the King List, generation after generation, did not misunderstand time. They understood something about humans. They understood that a beginning which can be fully grasped will eventually be exhausted. They understood that an origin made too familiar loses its ability to orient. So they preserved a beginning that resists comfort, a beginning that cannot be fully explained, cannot be easily dismissed, and cannot be reduced without losing its meaning. In doing so, they created a text that does not age in the way most records do. It does not become obsolete. It does not become outdated. It becomes challenging. The Sumerian King List challenges every reader to decide how they wish to stand in time, not where they stand, that is already determined, but how. Do we stand as owners of the present, believing that meaning accumulates only forward, that the past is something to be solved, corrected, or outgrown? Or do we stand as inheritors, aware that we occupy a position within a structure whose foundations lie far beyond our understanding? The King List gently favors the second position, not through argument, not through persuasion, but through scale. It reminds us that the present, no matter how advanced, no matter how informed, is not the source of order. It is a moment within it. This perspective does not diminish human achievement, it contextualizes it. The ancient world did not imagine itself as primitive, it imagined itself as late in a story that had already been unfolding for an unfathomable length of time. This sense of lateness carried responsibility. It meant that one ruled carefully, that one remembered. That one understood power as borrowed, not created. The King List encodes this understanding without ever stating it outright. It does not instruct, list it arranges. By placing the greatest reigns at the beginning, it ensures that no present ruler can claim ultimate authority. By allowing time to shrink after catastrophe, it accepts limitation without despair. By refusing to explain itself, it assumes a listener capable of patience. This assumption is rare. And perhaps this is why the list still feels strange. We live in a world that rewards immediacy, that values clarity over depth, that treats uncertainty as a flaw. The Sumerian King List offers none of these comforts. It offers distance, distance that creates humility, distance that allows memory to breathe, distance that reminds us we are not the beginning. There is something deeply human in this reminder. Because no matter how much knowledge expands, no matter how far history is pushed back through discovery, there will always be a horizon we cannot cross. The ancient world accepted this horizon. It did not try to conquer it, it honored it. The King List is not asking us to believe that kings ruled for hundreds of thousands of years. It is asking us to accept that the beginning of order was never meant to be small. A small beginning cannot hold a civilization together. A small beginning cannot stabilize memory. A small beginning cannot support authority. So the beginning was made large, not through spectacle, not through story, but through time. Time stretched beyond counting until the present could rest upon it without feeling alone. This is why the list ends without fanfare, why it offers no conclusion, why it simply stops, because history does not end, it pauses, and we listening now are part of that pause. Standing somewhere between the first descent of kingship and whatever comes after us. The ancient scribes could not imagine us, but they understood that someone would come later, someone who would read, someone who would wonder. They left space for that wondering. If this narration has done anything, it has not been to solve the mystery of the Sumerian King List. It has been to slow it down, to allow it to be what it has always been, a structure of memory, a quiet refusal to let the beginning shrink. And now, as this final moment settles, as the words begin to fade into silence, it is worth remembering one last thing. The King List survived not because it explained the past, but because it respected it, and perhaps that is why it still speaks. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. If you stayed with this narration until this final moment, you are already part of the quiet few who allow ideas to unfold slowly. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you can continue exploring history not as spectacle but as reflection. And if you watched until the end, take a moment to read the comments below. Others who listened this far often leave thoughtful insights, quiet questions, and perspectives that deepen the experience even further. Good night.